My name is Kevin Tucker. I'm an anarcho-primitivist. I live in Pennsylvania. I've been doing Black and Green Press for about 10 years now. Also running Black and Green Network. Co-started do Species Trader Journal. It's a very irregularly published anarcho-primitivism journal. Took part with Green Anarchy magazine when it's up and running and when it was working. I've been an anarchist now for about 16 years, an anarcho-primitivist, about 10 of those, and I write, speak on the subject. I became an anarchist around the time I was 13. It was the first Gulf War. Pretty much shook all my ideas about the world, the state of the world, and it kind of made me think about, not only resource extraction, things like that in a slightly different sense, but just the idea that this is what was going on, this was happening, it's not a movie, and it just kind of made it real. For the isolation that happens in America, it's stuff like war is kind of a foreign subject, and it happens, and it made me think about things a bit differently. But I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, which is the hometown of Monsanto, and Peabody Coal has headquarters there. The Shell is not located there, but which is the organization of Ogoni peoples, who were the people who were supposed to have been killed with Ken Saro-Wiwa in Ogoni land in Africa by Shell. We're all living in St. Louis, and there's all these insanely huge corporations and byproducts of people living there as a result of these same corporations. There was a really, really heavy political tinge throughout the 90s especially, but a lot of protests, a lot of things going on that involved resource extraction, that involved these bigger issues. And when I started thinking about that, started putting it together, it just shattered my essential worldviews about how things worked, about how economies worked, how things happened. It was almost like a night and day shift that occurred just kind of looking at what was going on and seeing what's happening, and then becoming involved in all these protest movements and all these struggles and things like that. And I got into anarchism at the same time, partially through like a lot of anarcho-punk bands, and I got into all that stuff at kind of the same time, and I always had this sort of like anti-authoritarian tinge, but very early on, as soon as, of course when you're kids you have everybody talking about anarchism and drawing anarchy signs on everything. I just, didn't really go through that stage. I just decided to actually look into it and started reading it with Goldman, Proudhon, Kropotkin, just from a very early age, and got involved with a lot of syndicalist kind of groups and all these earth liberation, animal liberation kind of ideas, and Earth First, things of that nature. There's a lot of development going on in St. Louis. It was one of the fastest growing areas in the United States for years in the 90s, and just seeing all these places I grew up around, all these woods that I would love to be in when I was younger, get torn down. And I would say that for probably the first 5 or 6 years that I was an anarchist, had this kind of disjoined version of anarcho-syndicalism where I was interested in workers' rights and things like that, but at the same time and very much about class dynamics, and still trying to incorporate all these ideas of earth liberation and animal liberation into the same subject. And around that time, around the late 90s, I got more involved with neoliberalism and critiques of technology, and the Unabomber trial had been going on. And then once the anti-globalization stuff was really blowing up, it kind of brought everything else into the scope. And then there was a certain point around 98, 99, where I was looking more at agriculture and coming from an eco-feminist perspective at trying to understand where does patriarchy originate. And looking at, Susan Griffin was really instrumental with her book Woman in Nature, was really instrumental in kind of broadening that perspective. And I had, through Earth First, come across a lot of deep ecological thought, and it just kind of all expanded, and I hit a wall at a certain point and said that at no point do any of my views about how the world works or how the world could work can, these ideas about industrialism fit in. And it kind of went through this little crisis mode, and then all these things blew up. And, in 99, we had a lot of the anti-globalization riots started happening. John Zerzan, anarcho-primitivist writer, he started being in the news and stuff like that, and all of a sudden, anarcho-primitivism and green anarchy came into the forefront. It was something that was just everywhere. It was pretty hard to ignore. And at that point, seeing it and looking into it, and as soon as I heard about John's work, I went out and bought 2 of his books and read them like that week, and I started writing them instantly. And I said, it's like this clicking moment where all of a sudden it made sense. All these disjoint ideas that I had accumulated over the years just kind of came together and said that, yes, this is a problem, and it is civilization. It's not something that can be, we can't talk about abolishing government and reforming industrialism or state-level society. The anarcho-primitivist critique of civilization, it gets misunderstood a lot of times. People see it as an ideology, and they look at it like anarcho-syndicalism is an ideology, anarcho-communism, and all these other sectarian forms of anarchism have a platform. They have an ideology. They have a starting point. They have a single critique, and that takes it through what kind of actions are determined by that, and what kind of society is determined by that. What anarcho-primitivism does differently, and I think it changes the nature of the critique and of what we look at as far as the origins of hierarchy and the origins of power, is that, this is our critique. This isn't a blueprint necessarily for the future. I mean, there, in the sense that if you could say there was anything, it's that humans are meant to be wild. Humans have lived as nomadic gatherer-hunters for, in some form of humans or proto-humans in millions of years. This is an anarchistic society that had existed this whole time and didn't need any force. It didn't need a platform. It didn't need any coaxing. And it just exists organically. And that's why I call it primal anarchy. And I think it's essentially who we are. But the critique itself isn't leaning towards this is one way to look at it, this is another. It's simply saying, and I know from my perspective where I came at it from was the question of, anarchism is always, where does power originate? And anarcho-communism, anarcho-capitalism, anarcho-syndicalism all look at the state level and distribution of wealth. And anarcho-primitivism looks at things differently in saying that, we had to go further. We had to look at where was the origins of patriarchy, which those people talk about, but I think they place it within class and racism and saying, and we just kept going further and further and saying, well, what happened? And one of the big things that happened was in the 60s, there was a revolution with anthropological thinking, and they started to rethink imperialist and Marxist kind of notions, although the Marxists were involved with it, of what indigenous societies are actually like, what nomadic gatherer-hunter societies are like, the whole pyramid scheme about how civilization originated, and this whole progressivist notion about how progress happens and how humans have changed or how human society has changed as like this linear monolithic event. That all got questioned, it all got thrown into question, and within a lot of the things that happened there as far as ecology, as far as feminism, it just kept pushing the critique and saying, this is how we were. And with that kind of information, which it took a long time to actually get into the anarchist circles, it's hard to continually say, okay, this history of capitalism, what we got from Marx and Engels, and what we got from Kropotkin and Bakunin, it's hard to look at that and say, they knew better just because they were around 100 years ago, or they were around because, in the late 1800s, they were seeing industrial changeover. But, I mean, that is a really limited perspective, and that perspective is limited to place, and you have to think about, what they knew and what they saw. I mean, you're talking about these ideas coming about in an era of industrialism where skies are black, people were working 60-hour days, and it's all they know. People had rickets because of the lack of sunshine, because of the amount of coal. And I mean, when you think about how much that changes your perspective, how much that can change your perspective, it's limited. It makes your world smaller. And those kind of notions just don't hold up over time. And they don't hold up when you look at things from a global perspective. And when you look at things from the area of earth liberation, or you even take into consideration animal liberation or anything else, it just, when we were looking at it, when I was looking at anarcho-syndicalism and asking those questions, it's just the state wasn't enough. The state was never enough. Religion was never enough. And you just keep digging further and further, and you have to understand. I mean, that's the whole point of anarcho-primitivism. And I think a lot of the criticism we get is that it is like an ideological stance, because John Searle's an anarcho-primitivist writer, a lot of his early stuff focused on origins, and people got focused on his take on it, which was focusing on symbolic thought, symbolic culture, whereas mine are a bit more about, the changes over caused by domestication, which of course he covers, but I think the focus is a little bit different. and people got hung up on the ideas that language and number are things that anarcho-primitivists are saying are the cause of civilization, or the cause of hierarchy. Whereas we're saying they're interesting aspects to look at because those are the tools by which authoritarianism stated itself. It's not that the first time somebody spoke, we were civilized and that was it, and it was a downfall. It's the total opposite of that. It's just a critique. It's saying, where did these things start? And it's not saying, this is necessarily the point we need to get back to, or this is the point we need to go to, or this is what we need to look to, and this is the society we need to emulate. There's a lot of mix and a lot of variation as far as how people take the anarcho-primitivist critique, but the general understanding is that it's not enough to just say, this is a concrete situation where you have authoritarianism. This is a concrete situation where you have a state-level society, or you have some sort of vestige of power or an institution of power. It's about looking back and saying, how did these things happen? How did we get from these millions of years that we spent in nomadic bands of gatherers and hunters, and then we got to this civilization, we got this global industrialized technological mess that we're in now. What made that possible? And as anarchists, as people who are hopefully going to live in anarchistic societies again, what points were those notions, what point were those stages able to creep in? And that's why we look at origins. That's why we talk about not just civilization, but we look at, where did these things happen? And what were the consequences of domestication? What were the consequences of human societies settling? And what are the consequences of domestication of plants and animals, and ultimately humanity itself? So it varies. I mean, that's how essentially it splits off from other anarchist ideologies and other anarchist critiques, is that we just say, what are the consequences of these deeper questions? I mean, I'm sure that a lot of anarchist syndicalists and stuff like that would probably disagree, and of course they do. But essentially it's just saying that that's not enough. And that all the things that the syndicalists have talked about, the communists have talked about, we're not saying those aren't true. We're not saying class and race and sexism aren't true. I mean, far from it. Totally far from it. And I think since we don't talk about it a lot, that tends to be something that gets put back on us, saying that, oh, you're not focused on it. It's like, no, we're anarchists. We call ourselves anarchists. There are people who call themselves primitivists. They're not essentially the same. I mean, there's racists who will call themselves primitivists, but it's just a totally different notion of what that word might mean, and it's something that we don't have any stake on the word primitivism, just like we don't have any stake on the word anarchism. But we choose those words carefully. We put them together, and we are adding to this. We are adding to the history of anarchism, the history of anarchist critique. So we do understand those things. We do agree that, the critiques of capitalism and every other form of state, there's truth to all of it, and there's issues with all of it, but it goes back. These are simply forms of the same thing. This is different forms of civilization, and this is how it's taken place, and this is how it's enacted. The name anarcho-primitivist is important on both sides. It's important on the primitivist side and the anarchist side. And I feel that anarchism, I take it at face value. I say that anarchism literally means anarchos, without city, without state, without government. And I take it for its literal meaning. And there's a lot of sectarian kind of issues within the anarchist milieu in saying, these people are anarchists, these people are anarchists, because I don't agree. I hate that. I hate that approach. And I disagree completely with, obviously like anarcho-capitalists, anarcho-communists, and most other kinds of anarchists. But I think that the basic definition of anarchist against government, or the basic connotation for anarchist, fits. And I understand that there is some level of camaraderie. I mean, I think that our ideas as far as civilization and general agriculture and industrialism vastly differ, but at base, I mean, that's the starting point. That's the simplest point for myself. And most other green anarchists or anarcho-primitivists is saying, yes, we agree, the state is the issue, and we hate it. We want it gone. We agree on that point. We agree communism, capitalism, or varying degrees of communism for whatever anarchist you got to talk to. But capitalism is an issue. That this society that's been created because of it is an issue. We are against the government, but the interpretation we have as primitivists and putting the anarcho into it is giving it a larger context. And it's not simply to say I'm an anarcho-primitivist, I don't care about anybody who's not an anarcho-primitivist, but it's to give a context, because there is context. There is context for anarchism, there's context for anarcho-communists. And I think it's about an honest appraisal of where I'm coming at. And it just, sometimes I say it as a time saver. If I'm talking to another anarchist, or I'm talking to somebody else, if I'm talking to somebody who knows nothing about anarchism, I'm saying anarcho-primitivism because I want to specify those things. I want to say, this isn't just me talking. This is, there's a history behind this. There's a milieu behind this. And don't just take my word for it. I want you to go look into it. I want you to take it as something that's worth looking into, as a critique on its own. So I think that those kind of words are important, because I don't want to pretend like this is Kevin Tucker's ideology, or I'm, going behind what John Zerzan said. I mean, I don't agree with everybody. I think that the critiques are important, but you need to understand that these are individual takes on critiques, and the more we do that, the better it's going to do for those critiques. The more that we're going to contribute to anarcho-primitivism, or whatever sect we're coming from. But it's really, I feel like, an honest appraisal. And I know a lot of people think that by identifying as an anarcho-primitivist, or identifying as some other form of anarchist other than just anarchist, also gives the notion that, we're all talking about the same thing, and we're not. And while I see it as obvious, I see it as an anarchist. I see, civilization as the root of power. I think that if you're talking about without government, you need to be talking about state-level society, and you need to be going back to early kingdoms and early agrarian societies and stuff that most anarchists wouldn't see as being governments or being a state. But they're state-level societies. It's essentially, for me, the same thing. And I'm not saying that their definition of anarchism is wrong. I'm just saying that my definition of anarchism sees that differently and sees that source of power differently. But I'm still an anarchist. I think that's important. What I've come to from having a background in cultural anthropology, and looking at that very question of where does power originate, or how does power originate, it became very clear from early on that earlier kind of notions of anarcho-primitivism, that there's hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists, and that symbolic thought, symbolic culture, played a large role in the nature of the change, in the nature of how oppression was possible. I kind of differed from that, and I feel that I don't necessarily disagree with some of the stuff that's been published about symbolic thought and symbolic culture, but I think that myself, like most anarchists, have kind of mistook what was essentially just a number of questions as a critique within itself. And the questions that were asked by John Zerzan with the Origins work, with talking about symbolic thought and symbolic culture, weren't meant to be the critique that people take them for. And I mean, to a certain degree, there's a lot of truth to it. There's a lot of issues, but the general notion being that how did symbolic thought, how did predominance on language, and how did the appearance of numbers within the human consciousness come about, and what impact did they have? But it's more about how did language become the main motive, our main method of communication with the world. How did that become our main means of understanding each other? And I think there's a lot about human psychology that's really wrapped up in that, a lot of really good, deep questions. But as an anthropologist, as somebody coming from kind of a cultural materialist perspective, I'm more interested in looking at what concrete changes happen, and not so much why. There's a lot of issues about archaeology, a lot of issues about why domestication started in some places and not others. And to a greater extent, I think that's kind of a question that's just never going to be answered. We're talking about something that happened 12 to 13,000 years ago, and it happened in a few areas, but we can look at the history of humans and proto-humans and things like that, and we can see that it happened. It most likely was a fluke. And from an ecological perspective, and understanding something like carrying capacity, which is how much life, or how much of a certain life can a given ecosystem support, you can see that what happened, or whatever happened that caused domestication, caused settling, was most likely a glitch. It's something that happened and something that humans had responded to, but you see it all the time in wildness. You see it all the time in ecology, and there's a temporary expansion of a certain population, and it hits a point where it can't be sustained, and then there's a return back to that level through whatever means. If it's too many of a certain resource being eaten off or destroyed, then there's got to be a bit of a die-off, or just not as many children being born, not as much population going on, or a shorter lifespan, whatever happens that causes that to be somewhat adjusted, whatever you want to call it. I don't like to give terms to ecological instances. But agriculture came about, and the domestication of plants and animals came about because people had settled in areas where there was vast amounts of storable grains or proteins. And you see the areas of domestication, the areas of sedentism, as the main sources of where civilization happened. You see it in Mesopotamia, you see it in China, South America, and Central America, various places in America. And you see these areas where civilizations were, and they existed, and they blew up, and then they fell. But it just seems like civilization is a prolonged fluke, and that we have this notion, these ideas of progress within the civilization, especially, but as a result of the Enlightenment thinking, that says, like, well, we've done this, we've gone on this path now, and we've changed it, and agriculture has changed carrying capacity, we've essentially conquered. But what happens is that agriculture it didn't change anything about how ecosystems function, it simply altered the games, and it altered the stakes, and it's not like, you can't break carrying capacity, it's like a rubber band, you just keep extending on it, and pushing on it, but it just means that when it comes back, it's got to come back faster and harder. And so it's just a matter of, looking at the history of agriculture as how has this expanded, how has this fluke carried on. But I think it's important to look at the origins, and I look at it from more concrete perspectives and saying, like, I don't know what caused people to settle. I don't know what happened. It's obvious, and we have enough evidence to say that if 99% of human history is nomadic gatherer-hunters, and these areas, there's maybe 3 to 6 areas with independent origins of domestication, and everywhere that civilization expanded, it expanded by force, not by choice. And there was no point at which anybody said this is what's going to happen. You just see that it was this, there is no set path to this. There's nothing that said this is what happened. There's nothing that ever changed. There's nothing about us as humans that has changed. We essentially are all nomadic gatherer-hunters, born into different circumstances. We carry with us the burdens of pollution. We carry with us all the toxins that are brought into our bodies and all the issues that are brought about because of an industrial world. But essentially we are nomadic gatherer-hunters. But you can see in these different societies, in societies, when you look at it more carefully, when you break it apart and say, okay, it's not just hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists. You have nomadic gatherer-hunters, you have semi-nomadic gatherer-hunters, you have semi-sedentary gatherer-hunters, you have hunter-collectors, you have horticulturalists in various stages. And all those societies still exist in recent times, and a lot of them are still struggling. And it's not about saying, this is our cutoff point for what is anarchism and this is not. It's simply saying, at what point, what changes in these societies happen with varying levels of domestication, and what were the consequences of that? And I think that the question of power, the question of oppression, essentially comes down to, not just where is it obvious that it's here and where is it obvious it's not, but how did it get there? And I mean, that narrative of progress plays a huge role, because we come from a society where there are intentional changes. We have, this vicious capitalist system where there are people sitting in rooms making decisions that will kill lots of people, will kill lots of animals, will destroy the land. And so it's hard for us not to imagine that ever happening before. But when you look about the slow curve of how we got to this point, how civilizations rose, and we're talking about, almost 6,000 years in most places from where people started settling to where you actually see the cities. And you see a different level of political structure that's possible. There was no conscientious change at any of those points. We're talking about this long span and reactions to it. And I think the ecological conditions, the cultural conditions changed, and then the ideologies kind of met up with it. You get the origins of religion, the origins of patriarchy, sense of property. These are all kind of created things. A nomadic gatherer-hunter simply does not have the language or the ability or the context of talking about property or talking about power, because they don't exist. They don't have that. They just don't. And they don't even have a sense of when you look at nomadic gatherer-hunters' sense of identity or sense of place or sense of community, it's based on the center and not the edges. They don't have an idea of borders. I mean, you won't find a square in nature. You won't find a line in nature. We created these things. This is a human civilization is created. And these are constructs in which we have, in which we're stuck with. But when you look at it, when you look at the origins of power, you have to not only think about, in our terms, where did this start, where did this start, where did this begin, but how the concepts even became possible. And that's what I think is important about the anarcho-primitivist critique and saying this is consequences of domestication, is not only that this thought arose from it or this system arose from it, but that it made that thought possible. It made the thought of like having a neighboring band that was competing for a resource. I mean, you don't have that in nomadic other harvest communities. You don't have, it's all fluid. You have a fluid sense of community, and you don't have a neighbor that's distinctly different. But the history of civilization is combating. It's fighting over resources. I mean, that's it. That's just what it is, and it's because of domestication that that's even possible. One of the main criticisms of anarcho-primitivism is that technology is neutral, and that technology has actually made our lives better, and that modernity has made our lives better. And there's a lot of ways in which that's a huge problem. And I think it's important to distinguish technology from a tool. Technology, I say, involves some kind of outside energy, some kind of outside force, or it takes multiple people to do, and it's not just like a tool which a single person can get together, have a certain amount of knowledge, of cultural knowledge, or personal knowledge and experience, and could do. Like, I could go out into the forest and I could, find rocks, I can flint and have a knife, I can make cordage, and I can make a stone axe, or I can make a knife, or something like that. I can make a fire. I mean, that's a tool. I cannot make a steel blade. I mean, that requires mining, that requires extraction, that requires all these processes that involve outside influence, outside sources, multi-groups of people. So they're totally different. And technology is a product of human society. And I think that my favorite thought on technology comes from Lewis Mumford, a historian, among many other things. And he had this, in Techniques in Human Civilization, he talked about how the first machine, the mega machine is what he essentially called it, had human components, and it was this mass organization of labor. It wasn't just about building pyramids through creating some new tools to do it, but the fact that you had all this surplus of people that could do this, and it's essentially it's a product of those societies. And there's so many problems with technology that we don't address. And to kind of break it down, I'll say the main thing that we get is that modernity has helped society, or helped humanity, and we've actually, achieved this kind of greatness. And it's the furthest thing from the truth. When you look at what people see about civilization, life without civilization, they take this kind of Hobbesian view, this Leviathan kind of view, that life before civilization was nasty, brutish, and short, that we lived 30 years, that we had, cavemen were just beating women, and it was just this kind of patriarchy, man, the hunter, kind of an insane mess, and then civilization came, gave order and all these things. But when you get when you really look at nomadic gatherer-hunter societies, I mean, the view is completely different. I mean, you're looking at anarchistic societies that not only didn't have all these kind of social institutions that we have, and the sexism, the racism, and any of the kind of values based on man work over woman's work, what is traditionally known as man's work over woman's work. You see egalitarian societies, and this is where it's existed. And when you look at it realistically, the lifespan of a nomadic gatherer-hunter is generally pretty good. It's better than where our average is now for the entire, developed and non-developed world. There's stories that, people can live up to 80, 90, 100 years. But I think that even looking at that is a problem, and it's not just saying like quantity. You're talking about quality. I mean, you're talking about societies where there was no distinction between work and play. You're talking about societies where you're dealing with community. You're not spending time going out and doing drudge work for another person. You're not stuck within this other identity for 40 hours a week where you have to work and you have to pay and you have to do this whole thing. I mean, there's a quality of life that far outweighs everything else. But you don't have the diseases, you don't have illness because people are moving around, and you don't have the social and ecological conditions which have bred the downfalls of a lot of people within society. So I mean, on the one hand, you have that on the realistic kind of question of comparing these two societies. The quality of life, I'd say, in a nomadic-gatherer society far exceeds ours, and far exceeds the benefits of losing all your friends so you can talk to them on Facebook or something like that. But the other side of it is that the history of civilization is where you get that nasty British short. When you look at the resource extraction areas where that happens, that's where you get that 30-year lifespan. That's where you get all these people dying. I mean, I work with a lot of Amish farmers right now, and it's just kind of a thing within their lives that their kids are going to die because they're working with these heavy tools for digging. And it's the agrarian way of life. That's why it's focused on having so many children. Is that it's your labor force, and you're going to have to replace it. But the other idea too, that within modern society that the average age is longer and greater, it's a total bullshit notion of kind of like not of a ghost economy. We're looking at first world standards, and the first world standards, and this is a problem that leftists have continually made, especially communism continually made, is you can't just look at the part here. You can't just look at the first world. You can't say we've got these freedoms and we're going to have these technologies that liberate us from work or whatever without looking at the conditions by the people who are mining it. Our basic day-to-day lives, this shirt, this clothes, I mean everything, even a groomed park like this, can't happen without ghost labor. It can't happen without ghost extraction, and all these things are going on in other parts of the world. And when you talk about how saying, the lifespan in America right now is whatever, 70, 80 years old on average. I mean, if you look at, 90% of Africa, the average life expectancy there is 4 years. 40, not 4. And that's because of the civil wars that are going on, because of resource extraction. That's going on in all parts of the world. You have these areas that are just basically the dumping zones of industrial society. And you can't sit there and say, well, we have 80-year life expectancy here and ignore the part where they got the 40%. You can't ignore the entire southern hemisphere, which is just holistically being destroyed and denuded for the sake of our lifespan or whatever value it is we place on living in a retirement home around no community and around nothing else but the notion that we've contributed to something good that we might eventually see that we're still waiting for. Like, well, what would it be like if we didn't have leaders? What would it be like if we didn't have the police? What would it be like if we didn't have all these facets of our society that are essentially control? And when you look at nomadic hunter life, when you look at societies where you actually had anarchistic societies, and the reason I call them primal anarchist societies or primal anarchy is because they function organically. There's the view that the Hobbesian, nasty, short, brutish view of life without civilization, which would, there's a reason that you get that image in popular media and within civilized mythology, is to get people to fear each other, to get people to fear what life would be like without. We would go back to clubbing each other and just violence and warfare. And when you look at it realistically and you see that's not how it happened, and that there's all kinds of ways in which nomadic hunter societies or even horticultural societies, but essentially anarchistic egalitarian societies deal with problems, and not only deal with problems, but address their existence, address the fact that, we're not always going to get along. We don't need to always get along. We just need to know our limits, and we need to respect that. Nomadic hunter society is fluid, and within a base camp, for most nomadic hunters, at any point, only about a third of the people permanently would identify with that group, would identify and say that this is what I call home, this is what I call my family, but they just go off. And if there's disputes, if there's problems, they are trained, the way that they deal with things from an early age is just to walk away, just to leave it alone. By creating cities, by creating these permanent structures, by creating these permanent conditions, we've kind of tossed out that idea and said, we need to always get along. When you move into an apartment, you move into a house, you don't know your neighbors, you don't get the chance to meet them, you look at the place, you sign the lease, whatever. Maybe you don't even meet your landlord. We have these ideas of permanence that push aside all notions of saying, we're humans, we have emotions, we have all kinds of things that you can't chart politically, but you just need to account for, and we created a circumstance where that's going to happen. And with property, and with the society that we've created by throwing out all these notions about what is human nature, or how do we react to things, or what might be a rightful or wrong response to whatever, or the community not knowing each other. Essentially being a community of strangers. is what has created, the fear. That is what's given, if any substances exist to it at all, that's what it is. And we live in a society that's horribly stratified. We live in a society with extreme class hierarchy or extreme social hierarchies. And we're always working for something that we can't attain, or even if we can attain it, it's not enough. That's the reason why you have all these issues. And it's simply a matter of saying, this is what you need to survive, and you have to go through these routes to get it, and while you get it, we're going to skim some off the top. And that's what creates, a culture of oppression, a culture of corruption, and that's, all these things that we're afraid of, and all these things are just rightful responses to an insane situation that we've been thrown in. That's messed with our minds, and all the noise, all the constant overflux of inputs, and all the sounds, and the stress of living in these lives. That's what causes people to go insane. And it's not that it never happens, but it doesn't give you a context for dealing with it. It doesn't give you a community to fall back on, and it doesn't even give you neighbors and family and community to watch and see if these things are happening. We just log on to the internet now and just see and be judged by a status update or something like that. And it's a social taboo, and it shouldn't be. And we take so much off the table, and then we're afraid of what might happen. But when you look at what happens when you have blackouts, you don't see it, or disasters or anything like that. Those are those moments where things get chaotic, and in that mess, it's just that human nature that we have that's suppressed by civilization, suppressed by domestication, comes out. And you don't have rights when power goes out. You get people coming together, and that's how we are. And we need each other, and there's that part of us that underneath all the conditioning, all the domestication, our bodies know that, and we yearn for it. I guess where does anarchism come from? It's from, there's a couple different senses of it. There's the actual word anarchism, and that obviously comes from the history of red anarchism. That comes from Proudhon, Bakunin, and Goldman, and Kropotkin. The anarcho-primitivist side of it, where does anarcho-primitivism come from? It takes a bit of a different route. It draws a lot of influence from deep ecology, the earth liberation, animal liberation kind of movements. John Moore, Freddie Perlman. We've drawn a lot from the post-leftists, from Jason McQuinn. John Zerzan is generally attributed to being part of that. Farrell Fawn, Lawrence Girac, all kind of tie into that, and Bob Black even. And just basically saying that the ideas of organization, the ideas of structure, even Jacques Camat stuff on organization and the left. It ties into this kind of split that we had that essentially led to that further questioning among the anarcho-primitivist critique of saying, we're not looking at enough by just looking at the state. So tracing that back, it just kind of ties into these kind of revelations that happened in the 60s as far as what was going on with cultural anthropology, what was going on with ecology, and tying all that in together. And I think that there's a little bit of a different strand that sets off, and I'd say starting in the 70s primarily, that kind of led to green anarchism and led to anarcho-primitivism. But as far as what I would consider lived anarchy or primal anarchy, the strain is completely different, and it's not about the ideology of anarchy. When you have nomadic gatherer-hunter societies or horticultural societies that exist now, that are essentially anarchistic societies. They're essentially fighting to live within the anarchistic world that they had lived in and their ancestors had lived in. It goes back to the origins of humanity. It goes back to the world even before. And as we lived in these nomadic gatherer-hunter groups, and when you had this flux, when you had this adaptive change and these adaptive elements within these societies, that not only negated power and negated the stance, but made it so that the thought of power, the thought of property, were completely impossible. And that's what I call anarchy. As I said, the history of anarchy is more about the history of anarchistic societies than the notion of anarchy that was created in the 1900s or the 1800s. And it pains me when I look at some of the stuff that's talking about case points for anarchism working, and looking at a co-op, or looking at a free space created by a commune or a squat. We're talking about contextual issues, and it's saying oh yeah, well, we made it work for 2 months in this period with these people. But it's my sense of anarchism, my sense of what an anarchist society would look like, doesn't need meetings. I mean, it has a kind of day-to-day community interaction with people and takes care of a lot of issues that arise as they arise, rather than, you know, you get the platformist kind of ideals with their meetings and their groups and saying, this is how it's going to happen, this is where we're going to go on, this is the issue of consensus. The truly organic anarchistic societies, the truly organic anarchy that I see having actually worked, and not just in a short period of time or work contextually, is the one where decisions aren't made that impact everybody else, where people have the ability to do what they want when they want. And that's generally what we've gone with, and I think that's what's within us. There's generally the question of, you know, what do I do as an anarcho-primitivist on a day-to-day basis that's different than other people? And I mean, there's elements of it that are there, but I generally don't like to focus on lifestyle choices. I don't think people being vegan, people dumpster diving, people squatting is going to make any kind of monumental change. And I don't believe in this kind of martyristic view where, oh, I'm going to be the person who, you know, I don't buy anything, or I don't you know, I refuse to sacrifice anything. I mean, it kind of buys into the mythologies of the left of like this eco view that, you know, if we don't buy anything by being in the society, then we're actually, you know, contributing to change. And I mean, the way I see it, this civilization is collapsing. And I mean, obviously, I think the more involved we are in the collapse, the better. But it's collapsing regardless. And I'm not saying that nothing should be done about it, but I'm saying that simple lifestyle choices aren't the change that's going to make anything do it. They aren't going to be the change to bring civilization down. That simple lifestyle choices aren't going to. And instead, it gets us caught up in all these lifestyle politics and kind of identity politics, the day-to-day politics about, well, you bought that or you bought that. I mean, for the most part, you know, I live a you know, civilized life like anybody else. I have to get by. I mean, you know, putting out the books, doing the writings, doing the tours, doing the talks, it takes money. And I mean, unfortunately, I have to, you know, work like anybody else. But I think that said, and there's a lot of things that are important. And I don't believe protest is going to change things. I don't believe protest is going to spawn a revolution and that's going to change everybody's hearts and minds. But I also don't believe, I'm not one of the green anarchists or the post-leftists or anything that wants to say don't go out and do it because it's worthless. People need to hear about these things. People need to know about these things. I'm not trying to breed apathy. I'm saying, you know, we don't need to breed apathy in the sense of thinking that a lifestyle change or a consumer choice is going to be the motivating factor in what happens with this civilization. We need to be out there. We need to talk to people. We need to give people context for what's going on, and we need to talk with people. And I like to see that. I like to see protests. I like to see people showing their anger, because that's not happening enough, because there's crackdowns on the side of the law. But as far as day-to-day practice, as far as what's important for me, as far as anarcho-primitivism goes, and how it impacts my views or where I see my life fitting into it, is the general notion of rewilding. The idea of actually going out and reconnecting with wildness, because that's one of the important things about what separates the anarcho-primitivist critique from a lot of other anarchist ideologies, is we're not talking about after the revolution, this is what's going to happen. Wildness isn't waiting for the revolution. It's existing everywhere. It's existing within us, and it's something that we can connect with and channel. And I think it'll really enrich our views as people and our understanding of the world to kind of break down our scientific reasoned understanding of the world and actually go out there and experience it. And also do it with friends, do it with community, have other people do it. And I mean, there's so much of my life that I can't put into words, and I don't like to put into words when it comes to rewilding. And I'm not trying to say that, you know, by any means I'm an example of what should or shouldn't be done. I'm just saying these are things that I can't equate, I can't put into a critique the way that I can talk about domestication. But I think there are essential elements of what it means to be human. And I'd hope that everybody gets a chance to experience that. And I think it's really important that people take those steps and do it. And I mean, not just because it's an ideological dogma, and I'm not saying, I've seen a lot of people get the ideas that, you know, rewilding is like a checklist of primitive skills. I mean, as soon as you get involved with it, you'll realize that's not how it works. I mean, will we eventually get to an anarchist society? 100% yes. I mean, we've been there. It's something that's within us. And I mean, it exists all throughout the world, and I mean, it's being fought off on a day-to-day basis by mining interests, and not just for oil. I mean, you're talking about the minute chemicals and the minute metals and plastics that get involved with making simple, what we consider simple throwaway technologies here. And I mean, what indigenous societies are facing in this world right now is insane. And what they're facing is insane because of the situation we created. I mean, I hope for us and I hope for them sooner than later. And I mean, I believe, when you look at the civilization, when you look at the state of the world we're in, I mean, these aren't unknown times. I mean, this is something I've been talking about, a lot of anarcho-primitivists have been talking about for years. We've been talking about peak oil. We've been talking about collapse. We've been talking about before it was in the news and before it was in the day-to-day shows. We're talking about climate instability. I mean, all the things that were happening, the recession and all these things that are going on right now, and political uprisings and food prices spiking. These are all things we knew were going to happen. We saw these things coming, and this is all a part of the collapse of the civilization. And all civilizations at some point collapsed or been engulfed by other civilizations. It's a history of civilization. It's simply falling and, in most cases, being taken over by a neighbor. And it's all predicated on resource extraction and having more and more resources. But at this point, we're looking at a globalized economy, a globalized civilization. And it's stretched so far and so wide, and it's so specific, it's so isolated. I mean, even if you wanted to talk about, an anarcho-syndicalist revolution, what's there left to take over? I mean, if you look at America, I mean, there's not even factories left here anymore, for the most part, and certainly nothing that would be sustaining it. You have monocropping all throughout the world, the IMF restructuring of agriculture. All of that changed the nature of the game, and saying that, revolution would change this, or revolution might change that, or will we have an anarchist society in this country, or will we have an anarchist society in this country? We're looking at the global collapse of civilization. And it's something that is not unprecedented, but it's unprecedented on this scale. And it's something that it's hard for me to see another 5 or 10 years of this. And it's everything's happening on time or even faster than the peak oil folks have talked about. And it's not just oil, it's about water. And it's about, clean air, clean food. And we've made ourselves so susceptible to any change in climate or any change in growing patterns could take the civilization out. And it's not going to be one thing, it's going to be this domino effect. And when you have the political unrest, when the oil stops pumping in one place, and it causes disruptions in coal extraction or in diamond mining extraction, which isn't only used for this ridiculously high profile capitalist thing, but also as the tips for mining equipment. When those things start happening, and as they have been happening, we're really just facing the end. I mean, so I think the essential question is not if, because I 100% know that's what's going to happen. That's what's within us, and as long as humans exist, as long as wildness exists, there will be eventually another anarchist society. But the idea is how long it will take and how we'll get there. And I'd like to say I'm more optimistic about there being some kind of conscientious change, but I don't think there will be. I think realistically, we don't have the time. I don't think a transition is not only not going to happen, I don't think that we have the time to make a transition happen. And it's really, how is it going to happen? And I'd rather not think about how it's going to happen on a year-to-year basis, but a generation basis. How long is it going to take for this to go? And I think the essential thing to take home from anarcho-primitivism, from my ideas, from what I tell people, is learn to live wild while you can. Learn as much as you can. It doesn't guarantee that whatever happens, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. It doesn't guarantee you any kind of survival. Being an anarcho-primitivist is not going to make me less susceptible to whatever might happen after civilization collapses than any other person. But there's innate knowledge that needs to come back. There's knowledge that we've lost being in civilization. There's knowledge that we haven't had the chance, and we've been cheated out of, that we have a right to learn. And the more we know, the more we spread that knowledge, the more we prepare people for what may or may not happen, the better the chances are that things will get better sooner and faster. And that's really all I can hope for. I mean, realistically, from my perspective, rewilding is a central part. But I don't want to tell people, just go out and do something and hope that it's going to make an impact, or just go out and rewild and that's it. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of anarcho-primitivists and saying like, oh, we're just going to be survivalists, or we're just talking about people being survivalists and things like that. I mean, I'm not talking about holding up and waiting for things to blow over. People need to know about what is happening. People need to be aware of why it's happening, because we need context. There's a narrative of progress. There's a narrative of civilization. it's not just a set of cultural and ecological and material circumstance. I mean, that's essentially what drove the ideology. But the ideology of saying that there are no other options, that we have to fear each other, that if we just, if electricity slips, there's going to be chaos and everything. I mean, that's all a part of what sustains civilization. That's a part of what keeps us going to work and what keeps us buying and keeps us going to the church or school or whatever. And the more we can do to combat that cultural knowledge or combat that idea and that ideology, the better the chances we have for getting anywhere. And for, I don't want to say waking people up, but I mean, at least give them an idea that there is an alternative. Give them an idea that there is something going on, and make people aware of the consequences of civilization. Make people aware of the consequences of technology. I mean, these are, it's not that saying consumer choices are going to change anything, but you need to know, and you need to know what's going on, and other people need to know. And I mean, we need to be angry. We need to realize that there's a reason why these things are going on, but we need to find each other. We need to recognize that community is an answer. Community is something that's going to help us in the long run, and that's essentially what we're talking about. That's essentially what we're looking at, and what we eventually will get to.